if I can ask all our speakers to go ahead and come on up here, if you don't mind, for our panel discussion. And I want to, since we just have 20 minutes for our panel discussion, I want to invite any of you to start coming up to the microphones if you'd like to ask a question. While you're thinking about questions you might have, one initial question that I would have is just as you've heard each other's presentations, one of the things that we were wondering about was if there are particular strengths or limitations of the combinations of approaches that we've heard this afternoon, sort of what you would think about moving forward in terms of being able to actually apply taking action based on the kind of information that we have, what you think of the strengths and limitations of the different approaches. So actually this, I guess, is number 2 on our list of questions up here. I don't know, do you have any thoughts as a panel starting off? You're welcome to, yes, if you have thoughts.
Well, I love the last talk, so that was great. I've learned a lot. Yeah, I mean, I think in...
Could you use the microphone?
I think what you were addressing really does lend itself to observational epidemiology for the right exposure. So years ago, we used, for example, acetaminophen as a kind of negative control for for NSAIDs. So it's not as perfect as some of your other examples, but I think what you were addressing is really something that we should all do in our studies, is really kind of think through other kinds of things that we measure that would be a good test then. So I really liked your talk.
I guess if there aren't any other thoughts, why don't we go ahead and Melissa, you can jump in.
Melissa Perry, George Washington University. So in a very interesting section, for sure. I learned a lot from each of your talks. I have 2 questions for 2 of the speakers, for Dr. Chutkan and also Dr. Smith, but maybe there's a relationship to my questions that has to do with vocabulary and language and the extent to which we're communicating in reproducible ways and that we're truly understanding the terminology that we're all using within our scientific paradigm. So Dr. Chutkan, I wanted to ask, when I hear control, I immediately think about something that can be manipulated. And so what I may have just learned from your talk is that negative controls in observational studies aren't necessarily things that you deliberately and willfully assign to, but rather occur, and you can actually take observations from what's happening in that control situation, even though you have not manipulated or created it.
You understood correctly. It's even worse than that. In economics, we use controls. They call confounders controls. And so it's not just in epidemiology or biostatistics. It's across all these disciplines. We need to find ways of communicating better. Press the button. Oh, I'm not pressing the right button. Okay. I'm done anyways.
Okay. And that was very useful for me so that I can step outside of the confines of my terminology so that I'm understanding the context of this alternative approach in observational studies versus randomized controlled trials. And then for Dr. Smith, I was compelled by the criteria that you and your group have worked on with respect to chemical carcinogenesis, and wanted to ask if those categories are mutually exclusive, or rather could multiple actions be happening and be attributable to the same chemical. For example, what I mean by that is one category was genotoxicity and another was cell proliferation. And when I think about chemical carcinogenicity and aneuploidy, which is actually numerical extra chromosomes that could well be happening through a genotoxic pathway, but also via cell proliferation at the point of meiosis or mitosis. So is it understood, is it a given that each of those categories are mutually exclusive and discrete?
Well, to some extent they are discrete. But so aneuploidy would be under the genotoxic as a change in chromosome number, and so it would be an inherited genetic change. So it'd be a mutation. So obviously, in order for the mutation to be expressed, you have to have cell proliferation. But whether the chemical would not, that was an aneuploidogen, would not be forced to produce cell proliferation. And so I don't see how you'd get cell proliferation would give you aneuploidy without there being an impact on the mitotic spindle or other mechanisms for aneuploidy induction. And so generally, the key characteristics are mutually exclusive types of events.
Okay.
He said, well, how about the receptor-mediated effects of cell proliferation? Well, cell proliferation is one of the effects of receptor-mediated effects. It could also be inhibition of cell proliferation or altered gene expression in some other fashion without cell proliferation. And so you have, but the key point there is really the impact on the receptor rather than the impact on the cell proliferation.
Gary.
Gary Ginsberg, Connecticut Department of Public Health. And I also have a question for Dr. Smith, but since you were just on, I'll ask a different question to a different panel member, give you a chance to rest a little bit. So for Dr. Terry, hi again, and I'm getting the impression from your PAH slide that if you're working in an epidemiological setting with a high-risk population, that it may be easier to see the effect of, say, an environmental exposure if you're already working in that kind of a population rather than just a broad, general, randomized population. So can you say more about that? Would you think that there's a general premise or rule there about epidemiology trying to focus more on that a certain end of the curve or a certain vulnerability set to be able to see environmental effects?
Thank you. I would certainly argue that a lot of average risk cohorts, just like case control studies that really are average risk, if you think about how most case control studies are done, they really span the age of 20 to 100. So they may be underpowered to have enough people at the very high end of the spectrum. So I do think, in the past, people thought family studies are only useful for gene discovery. But to the extent that we know that even within high-risk families, that you can modify risk. I think the most interesting twin study for cancer was published this past year. It was like 30 different cancers. I think it was at least 100,000 twin sets. And what they showed was very interesting because it really did show not as much concordance as you would expect for most of the cancer. So obviously there's a huge role for the environment, even in high-risk families.
And from a risk assessment perspective, it's hugely important to understand who we're projecting risk for, and if it's for some generic average risk population versus if we really understand the risk in a part of the curve that's more vulnerable, that would help us understand how protective we're being. So I think that is a good direction for epidemiology. And the question for you, Dr. Smith, is you mentioned ToxCast a little bit, but I'm wondering what your perspective is on how good a job or how predictive is ToxCast for the different qualities and characteristics of carcinogens right now. Can we go from the in vitro for something off the shelf and say it's got 4 out of 10 or 6 out of 10, or where do we need to go? And then also in terms of relative potency to be a carcinogen. So we understand a little bit about read across with AH receptor. We understand a little bit about how potent is something if it's a mutagen or a certain potency of mutagen. But if you start blending across all these different endpoints, and we have ToxCast data coming out on a lot of these different endpoints, how do we understand and project cancer risk for those different types of endpoints and data streams?
Unfortunately, I think most of the ToxCast and Tox21 assays don't fit to the key characteristics. A few of them do. based on, for example, the estrogen receptor or PPR gamma and things like this. So in the receptor-based category, there is a few. There's quite a number, the largest number, I think, are in the cytotoxicity type category, which would come under group, under the 10th key characteristic. There are essentially none for genotoxicity, DNA repair, genomic instability, electrophilicity in the ToxCast and Tox21 battery. And I don't really think there's any for epigenetic effects either. Certainly there aren't any for immunosurveillance or immunosuppression, and I don't think you can measure inflammation. I see John's getting up, he may disagree with me. But I think many of those, from my review of it, there is very few that currently that fit with the key characteristics, and that's why I was partly saying that there is a need for the design of new tests that fit to these key characteristics. And if John wants to respond.
Do you want to do that first?
Well, I would say, in general, we need more but we do have a number in the Tox21 program. We've focused on receptor-mediated changes. We have a battery of nuclear receptors. And the other emphasis has been on general stress response pathways. So we have mitochondrial effects. We have a number of DNA repair enzyme assays that have come out of a laboratory in Japan. So I would say also that as we're moving forward, we're going to a transcriptomic-based approach. So we'll be doing transcriptomics, dose response transcriptomics. So we'll get the full panoply of responses in these cell systems. So there's hope. It's not immediate, but within the next year or two, I think you're going to be able to see quite a dramatic expansion in the amount of information coming out of the in vitro assays. And these will be coupled with similar assays done in vivo, so we can do the bridging as we go forward.
I didn't mean to imply it was hopeless. I meant to say a revision and expansion of the program is needed.
Exactly.
Thanks for deferring. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Lisa Aylward from Summit Toxicology. I'm interested in maybe pushing back is too strong, but challenging you a bit on the characteristics identified for carcinogens. And the reason I'm interested in is because when I look at that list, outside of the context of carcinogens, it looks to me like a list of many of the characteristics we would think of as generally just being biologically active, interacting with a receptor or modulating hormones, causing oxidative stress. I can't remember the full list here, but I'm wondering to what extent that list of characteristics is specific enough to carcinogens that it's more useful as an identifier for carcinogens than as an identifier for chemicals that are just generally biologically active. And then in addition, the next step on that is, where does potency, efficacy, and combination come into a framework for evaluating chemicals? In other words, I can imagine a check in many of those categories, but at concentrations which are not biologically relevant, or there's a variety of applications. So how is the framework structured to kind of be a little more sophisticated in incorporating that information?
It's very good points. I mean, I think the way that the framework is meant to work is that, first of all, it's a way of systematically reviewing what's out there. And I would agree with you largely on the biologically active component, although it was really based on chemicals that we know are carcinogens. They may have other effects too. And it was really a way of systematically reviewing the literature and then getting it down to a manageable amount where you could then review. And then obviously you would review those papers, and if it takes an unbelievable amount of the chemical to cause oxidative stress, that's unlikely to operate in humans at doses that humans would experience. And so that's where the second part comes in. So I think, yes, they could possess these characteristics, but is that likely to operate in humans is the next part. So I think it's really a framework that's built upon those two things. And so I think it's essentially a way of just systematizing the review and allowing people to make that and to fine-tune it down to the kind of decisions that you just mentioned.
All right, we have about 5 minutes left, and I'd like to see if I can sneak in 2 questions. We've got one here, but I also want to acknowledge our observers on the web, and we have a question from the web from Patricia Patterson. She was wondering, in light of all the problems in inferring legal causation related to exposure to a single pollutant, so we heard this morning about the worries about a risk ratio of 2 being as a means of inferring legal causation. She asks, how could anyone prove legal causation related to exposure to multiple pollutants with associated individual risk ratios? So kind of a challenging question. Would any of you be interested in biting that off very quickly before we turn to our other question? If you think it's too complicated, we can defer it. But all right, so. All right, well, since we only have about 4 minutes, I'll let you contemplate if you want, but we do have another questioner here in the...
Thank you for your courtesy.
Yeah.
I'm Arnie Schwartz from George Washington University. In the realm of biologic plausibility, in order to create some of these associations, there was a good deal of model building by a variety of speakers this morning and the excellent cast this afternoon, concerning model building with respect to the so-called Weinberg pathway, characteristics, issues dealing with pathways, issues dealing with systems, issues dealing with networks, and there was an attempt to make a distinction among these groups. Is this really a distinction without a difference? Does it really matter how you approach it? Is the approach of a system very different than the Weinberg characteristics? Are, in fact, the characteristics basically a composite of a modeling system that interacts with systems and networks within a biological frame? So in other words, what I'm asking is, isn't this all the same? And we really don't have to look at characteristics or systems because they're all interrelatable.
I don't really fully understand the question. I think the question you're saying is that systems and all of these other things are all the hallmarks of cancer, they're all one and the same. And no, I just basically no. But I think I think the message I was trying to put out is if you wish to model, you should model based on a systems type of approach, where you think of biology as networks and as systems rather than as individual stochastic pathways. And so I don't really think they're all the same, but because the hallmarks are actually properties of cancer cells, whereas characteristics I described are properties of actually the chemical agents or agents per se. And so, but I think in terms of modeling, a systems approach would be essential.
If I can, I think we do have 2 minutes. We do have this final question up here. How much information is needed before a decision can be made to limit an exposure or take other actions? And like Dr. Buckley, you were encouraging us in your talk to actually be thinking about interventions and so on. And I wondered if any of you wanted to comment just briefly as we wrap up about sort of taking these case studies and actually thinking about action, actually needing to intervene and make decisions. I think our web caller was thinking about that in the legal context. Would any of you want to comment on just sort of drawing lessons from these presentations for actually making decisions about intervention or action?
I'm just thinking with kind of talking about the risk factor approach, and the things that are really obvious have been kind of identified at this point, and a lot of the discussion that we've had is how we can identify new things and novel technologies, and I'm not sure what the answer is for how we use those for risk assessment.
Yeah.
I guess what I wanted to do is maybe go back to the general question about can observational studies be used to infer causality. And it's not one of the examples we discussed today, but it's an example that's often discussed in epidemiology, in that can we be too cautious about the data and not act soon enough. And so the example that's often discussed at epidemiological meetings is the association between number of sex partners and cervical cancer. Even though for 400 or 500 years we knew that nuns were more likely to get breast cancer and less likely to get cervical cancer, and since at least the 60s and 70s there were case control studies that supported the number of sex partners you had, the more likely you would to have cervical cancer, but nobody wanted to act on that because of observational epidemiology and all of the flaws with measurement of those kind of constructs. And so now we know, obviously, the human papillomavirus causes not just cervical cancer, but head and neck cancer and anal cancer. And those same constructs in studies that people have looked at, number of sex partners with anal cancer or head and neck cancer, you have all those same problems with measurement. But because we know the virus now, we know that's causal. But the size of the association for just that construct, albeit extremely poorly measured, was 3, 4, 5-fold in these studies that were done in the 80s. And so even without knowing the virus, you would at least know how to tell people to come for screening that would be more susceptible. So I think for a public health point of view, even when we don't know everything in that black box, we could still use some of the information for at least understanding who would have a greater susceptibility.
Great, thank you very much, and thanks to our panelists and their talks.